Welcome to the Inner Essence, a space of mindfulness, spiritual awakening, and reconnecting with your true self. Breath, be present, and begin your journey with it.
Have you ever noticed that sometimes it feels like your own mind is running the show, and you're just watching from the sidelines? A thought appears, an emotion follows, and before you even realize it, you've already reacted. Then comes that familiar question, why did I do this again? But what if there's another point inside you, silent, steady, that sees all of this happening? And what if, when that inner observer takes the lead, your entire sense of identity begins to shift? Today, we explore how the simple act of conscious observation doesn't just change your thoughts, it changes who you are. There's a strange moment that sometimes happens when you're driving alone. You reach your destination, but you can't quite remember the journey. The turns, the red lights, even the lane changes, all of it happened without conscious input. It's unsettling at first, but then you shrug it off, thinking, well, that's just how it is. Yet that same mechanism, that unconscious automatic guidance, runs far deeper than your daily commute. It's steering your words, your emotions, your decisions, and the stories you tell yourself about who you are. Most of what you call you is a collection of rehearsed responses, patterns practiced so many times that they no longer need your permission to run. You wake up and reach for your phone before your eyes are even fully open. You sip your coffee the same way, scroll through the same feed, feel the same small spikes of irritation or pride depending on what you see. These microactions build a rhythm that feels personal, but it's actually mechanical. The mind loves efficiency. It learns behaviors the way a river learns a groove in the earth, by repetition, by the path of least resistance. Every reaction becomes a deeper channel, and soon, even when you want to change direction, the current pulls you back. That's why the same arguments, the same fears, the same cravings keep repeating themselves. It isn't personal failure, it's programming. The autopilot, you call me. What's unsettling and fascinating is that this autopilot is not malicious. It was built to keep you safe, to conserve energy, to make quick choices in a world that once demanded survival reflexes, not deep reflection. The trouble begins when those reflexes start deciding everything for you, even in moments that require awareness, curiosity, or pause. When life becomes a constant series of reflexes, you're no longer living it, you're being lived by it. You can see this autopilot in the small moments. Notice how your body tightens when someone interrupts you. Observe how a single phrase from a coworker triggers a flood of defensive thoughts before you even know what's happening. Somewhere, a decision is being made, but it isn't conscious. The body reacts, the mind justifies, and the identity rushes in to say, that's just me, that's how I am. That statement, that's just how I am, is one of the most powerful traps of conditioning, because it seals the system. It tells the autopilot, keep going, you're doing fine. Yeah, but if you pause long enough to actually look, you might realize something quietly revolutionary. You didn't decide to feel that way. The feeling appeared, and then you claimed it, like a voice on a radio that you mistook for your own thoughts. There's a hidden danger here. When you live entirely from this mode, life starts deciding for you. The world becomes a mirror that keeps showing you the same image, not because it's the only one available, but because you keep showing up as the same version of yourself. The me that responds automatically can't imagine alternatives. It only knows what it's already done. And yet there's a crack in this mechanism, a subtle space that appears between impulse and reaction, a gap so thin it's easy to miss. But within that gap lies the beginning of freedom. You've probably felt it before. The microsecond pause before saying something you'll regret, the brief awareness that you could choose differently. That's not the autopilot. That's the observer. The silent presence behind the program, watching the pattern unfold. Once that crack is noticed, it starts to widen. The riverbed that once seemed carved in stone begins to soften. You begin to sense that perhaps there's another layer of you beneath the mechanical rhythm, something that doesn't react, but perceives. And this realization can feel both thrilling and unsettling. Because if so much of your life has been run by habit, then who have you really been? Don't rush to answer that. Just stay with the question. Feel how it lands in your body. Somewhere behind the noise of the routine, a quieter awareness is waiting. One that doesn't need to do anything to exist. It only needs to be noticed, and once that noticing begins, something curious happens. The autopilot loses a bit of its authority. You start to see the machinery instead of being it, and that almost imperceptible shift is the doorway to something deeper. Because if the autopilot isn't truly you, then who exactly is watching it? If you slow down enough, not just physically but internally, you might notice something almost invisible, a quiet point inside you that doesn't move, even when everything else does. Thoughts can race, emotions can surge, the body can tighten or tremble, and yet something in you remains still, untouched. That stillness is not absence, it's awareness itself. This point is what some traditions call the witness, others the seer, and some more simply the observer. But it's not a role you play, it's a dimension of consciousness that's always been there, quietly present behind every experience. You don't become the observer, you realize you already are it. The realization doesn't come from effort, but from noticing. Try this, just for a few seconds. Bring your attention to a thought that's passing through your mind right now. Maybe it's a worry, a plan, a memory. Instead of following it, just look at it as if it were a cloud moving across the sky. Don't try to change it or stop it. Simply observe. For a moment, there's a gap, a small distance between you and the thought. That distance is everything. In that instant of observation, something shifts. The thought no longer defines you. It's simply something being noticed. And what notices it? That silent presence doesn't have an opinion, doesn't rush to label or fix. It just sees. The realization can be subtle, almost disappointing at first, because it feels too simple. But that simplicity is the key. The observer doesn't need to do anything. Its power lies in pure awareness. When you start to inhabit this perspective, even briefly, a quiet freedom appears. It's as if a window opens inside a crowded room. The noise doesn't vanish, but fresh air begins to move through. You see that anger can exist without you being angry. Fear can arise without you becoming fear. The emotion loses its claim over your identity, and this is the beginning of what can only be called an identity shift. Until now, you were the sum of what you felt and thought. But the moment you recognize that you can observe both, a deeper truth emerges. The observer isn't a part of the content. It's the space that holds it. It doesn't belong to the story. It's the awareness in which the story unfolds. What's even more extraordinary is that this awareness isn't cold or distant. It carries an intelligence of its own, a quiet coherence that naturally calms what it sees. When you observe a storm without resisting it, the storm begins to settle, not because you control it, but because observation itself is an act of integration. The observer doesn't fight the mind, it harmonizes it. Yet here's the paradox. As soon as you try to be the observer, you've already lost it. The mind can imitate observation. It can create a subtle watcher that's still entangled with judgment. I'm doing this right. I'm not calm enough. I should be more detached. That's still the ego wearing a new costume. The true observer has no agenda, no desire to succeed. It's the awareness that remains when all effort stops. This is why silence, not outer silence but inner quiet, becomes so valuable. When you stop chasing, stop performing, stop fixing yourself for a moment, the observer comes into focus naturally. It's not a technique, but a remembering. You begin to sense that behind the constant motion of thought, something steady is holding everything in place. That something is you, before the word you was ever learned. As this recognition deepens, life starts to feel subtly different. The gap between reaction and awareness widens. You start to notice your own mind like you'd notice weather patterns, not as judgments, but as phenomena that come and go. You might even catch yourself mid-thought and smile, not because you solved anything, but because you saw it happening in real time. And each time that happens, the observer grows stronger, not by force, but by familiarity. Like eyes adjusting to darkness, awareness becomes clearer the longer you rest in it. The chaos of thoughts doesn't disappear, it just stops being mistaken for the whole sky. Still, this realization is only the beginning. Because once you've tasted that silent point, the next question inevitably arises. Why do I keep losing it? Why does the pull of old patterns and emotions still feel so strong, even when I know I am not them? That question, the tension between seeing and identifying, is where the next challenge begins. The mind doesn't like being observed for long. It wants attention back. It wants to be you again. And that's where the most subtle trap waits, and the trap of identification. The moment you begin to recognize the silent observer within you, something liberating happens. But right alongside it, a subtle danger appears. The danger is not external, it's not someone else trying to pull you off your path. It's the magnetic pull of identification, the deeply ingrained reflex to mistake what you experience for who you are. Every emotion, every thought, every sensation that passes through you carries a kind of gravity. Anger pulls you into its orbit and says, "You are me." Fear whispers, "You can't survive without me." Pride tells you, "You are what others think you are." The identification is immediate, automatic. You don't notice it happening. You only realize it once you're already inside the storm. This is why suffering feels so personal. You don't suffer because of the event itself. You suffer because of the way you claim ownership of it. The thought, "They disrespected me," becomes "I am disrespected." The emotion, "I feel afraid," becomes "I am fear." The difference is only a few words, but that shift from feeling to being is what locks you inside the experience. The mind has an ancient habit of turning movement into identity. When something arises inside you, it immediately wants to name it, store it, define it. That naming process creates the illusion of solidity. This is who I am. This is how life treats me. This is my story. And once that story is established, everything you perceive begins to serve it. You don't see reality anymore. You see confirmation. That's the trap. Identification narrows perception until you're no longer observing life. You're defending an image of yourself. Every interaction becomes a subtle negotiation to keep that image intact. The smallest challenge, a disagreement, a mistake, a failure, threatens it. And suddenly you're no longer responding to the present moment. You're reacting to protect an identity that was never real in the first place. If you look closely, you'll see this mechanism at work in everyday situations. Imagine someone cuts you off in traffic. The body reacts, tension in the chest, heat in the face. The mind rushes to interpret, "What a disrespectful person." Then, in less than a second, it goes further. "Why does this always happen to me?" The event is long over, but now it's personal. You've become the offended one, the victim of a stranger's carelessness, and the story of me grows a little stronger. Here's the paradox. The more tightly you hold on to identity, the more fragile it becomes. Because identity, by its nature, depends on contrast, on something to define itself against. You can't be the strong one without imagining weakness. You can't be the successful one without comparing yourself to failure. You can't be the spiritual one without subtly measuring others as less aware. The ego's existence depends on division. And yet, somewhere beneath all that noise, the observer still watches. It doesn't choose sides. It doesn't care whether you look wise or foolish. It simply notices. The observer is the part of you that can recognize, "Ah, I've been caught again." That simple recognition, not judgment, just awareness, weakens identification. It doesn't destroy the ego, it just sees through it. But the process isn't linear. The ego doesn't surrender quietly. It uses sophisticated disguises. Sometimes it pretends to be humility. "I'm so flawed, I can't help it." Sometimes it hides behind virtue. "I'm doing this for the greater good." Sometimes it even uses spiritual language. "I'm observing so well now. I must be more conscious than before." In each of these cases, identity has just shifted costumes. The actor hasn't left the stage. It has only changed clothes. The deeper danger comes when identification becomes so subtle that it feels like authenticity. You might say, "This is just my truth," when in reality it's a conditioned pattern speaking. You might defend your limitations because they've become familiar, comfortable, even safe. The ego would rather suffer predictably than dissolve into uncertainty. But that dissolution, that uncomfortable moment when your story starts to crack, is precisely where the next shift begins. When you can hold an emotion without fusing with it, when you can say, "There is sadness here," instead of "I am sad," the observer starts to take the lead. The me that once demanded to be the center begins to loosen its grip. This loosening isn't a grand awakening, it's often quiet and ordinary. You find yourself pausing before reacting. You sense a little space between thought and response. You hear your own internal commentary and realize, that voice isn't me. It's just a habit of interpretation. Each of these small recognitions is like a tiny fracture in the shell of identity. And through those cracks, light starts to enter. Eventually, the structure that once felt so solid, the self built from opinions, emotions, and memories, begins to tremble. It doesn't collapse all at once. It dissolves in moments of clarity, one recognition at a time. And when that happens, when the illusion of being your thoughts starts to fade, a quiet awakening begins. It's not dramatic. It feels more like waking from a long dream, realizing you were never the character struggling within it. That's the point when something extraordinary occurs. The observer, which has been patiently watching all along, begins to take the lead. There comes a moment, often small, unplanned, and quiet, when you catch yourself in the act of being you. A flash of awareness pierces through the usual stream of reactions, and you see it happen. The thought rising, the emotion forming, the body preparing to respond. But instead of being pulled into it, something in you simply watches. The machinery continues, the pulse quickens, the thought unfolds, yet now there's a presence that stands apart. That's the moment the observer awakens. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. In fact, if you're expecting fireworks or mystical visions, you'll probably miss it. The first awakening of the observer often feels disarmingly simple, almost anticlimactic. You might be washing dishes or walking across a parking lot when you notice it. A feeling of irritation flickers. Maybe someone said something that triggered an old pattern, and for a split second, you see both the irritation and the part of you that's aware of it. That split is the beginning of freedom. It's not detachment, it's clarity. You're still human, still feeling, still thinking, but no longer possessed by what you feel or think. There's a subtle but radical difference between having an experience and being the experience. When the observer awakens, you move from the latter to the former. The experience still arises, but it's no longer your master. In that first instant, something astonishing happens. The emotions that once seemed overwhelming start to soften. The inner noise quiets without you trying to quiet it. You're no longer chasing calm. Calm happens by itself, because the energy that once went into resistance is now free. The simple act of observing without judgment changes the entire texture of consciousness. It feels like waking from a dream you didn't know you were in. The dream isn't evil. It's just automatic. For years, perhaps decades, you've lived as if you were the sum of your thoughts, reacting to life as though each passing emotion was a fact about who you are. But when the observer steps forward, that illusion starts to lose its authority. The identification begins to crumble, and in its place arises a sense of spaciousness, as though your inner world suddenly gained an extra dimension. This shift doesn't mean the ego disappears overnight. What changes first is your relationship to it. The voice in your head that used to sound like the absolute truth now begins to sound mechanical. You can almost hear the patterns repeating themselves, trying to pull you back into the old rhythm. But now you see them. The seeing itself dilutes their power. The habit may still speak, but it no longer dictates. Sometimes this awakening brings an unexpected emotion: grief. You might feel a quiet sadness for all the years spent asleep inside the storm of thought, mistaking noise for self. Yet even that sadness is witnessed by the same awareness that's now awake. The observer doesn't deny emotion. It holds it gently, like light filtering through water. In that holding, the emotion transforms. The energy once trapped in resistance becomes presence. From a biological perspective, this is not just poetic. When observation takes place without reactivity, the brain shifts from the amygdala's defensive circuitry to the prefrontal regions associated with regulation and insight. You literally move from survival mode into awareness mode. The chemistry of consciousness changes, and with it, your sense of who you are. And here's where the real identity shift begins. You realize, I am not the voice in my head. I am the one who hears it. That sentence, if truly lived, can dissolve years of unconscious identification. It doesn't make you passive, it makes you lucid. Life continues. People speak, emotions arise, responsibilities remain. But the center from which you live has moved. You're no longer the character trapped in the story. You're the awareness in which the story unfolds. At first, this new way of being can feel unstable, even fragile. You glimpse the observer clearly, then lose it just as quickly. Old habits pull you back, the ego whispers in familiar tones, and the mind reclaims the stage. But something has already changed. Now you know there's another vantage point. You've tasted consciousness free of identification, and once that taste happens, it can't be forgotten. Even when you fall back into old patterns, the observer remains quietly aware in the background, waiting for your attention to return. This is the first identity shift, subtle, invisible to others, but monumental in effect. You no longer live entirely as the personality, you begin to live as the awareness behind it. The self that once felt so heavy, so easily threatened, starts to lose its density. There's more space between stimulus and response, more grace in how life moves through you. But the ego doesn't surrender its throne easily. The moment it senses it's losing control, it begins to resist. It creates distractions, urgency, guilt, anything to pull you back into its drama. And as awareness grows stronger, its counterattack becomes more refined, more seductive. The very next movement, after the awakening of the observer, is the ego's retaliation, the silent struggle to reclaim the lead. The moment the observer begins to take the lead, the ego feels it, like a dethroned king sensing rebellion in the court. It doesn't vanish quietly. It gathers its forces, not with noise and spectacle, but with subtlety. The ego knows every corner of your mind, every button it can press to draw you back into identification. And so it begins its counterattack, not to destroy you, but to survive. At first, it might come dressed as confusion. You start to doubt what you experienced when awareness first opened. You think, maybe I imagined it. Maybe this observer thing isn't real. That's the ego planting fog over the clarity you glimpsed. Because if you question the observer long enough, you'll stop being the observer and return to being the thinker, the role it knows how to play best. Then it shifts tactics. It creates drama. Small inconveniences suddenly feel enormous. You spill your coffee, and it's not just an accident, it's a bad day. Someone disagrees with you, and instead of a simple difference in opinion, it becomes a personal insult. The ego thrives on magnification because emotional intensity feeds it. Each time you react, it reclaims a bit of territory. It knows that presence and drama can't coexist for long. One always displaces the other. When that fails, it reaches for guilt. The voice in your head begins whispering, "You should be more aware. You're not evolving fast enough." Notice how clever that is. The ego uses the very language of spirituality to sustain itself. It builds an identity around being conscious, and then punishes you whenever you fall short of that image. You move from ordinary identification to a subtler one, the observer persona. But behind the mask, it's the same old structure wanting control. Sometimes the ego uses urgency. It floods you with thoughts of what must be fixed, improved, achieved right now. It knows awareness slows things down, so it accelerates everything. The mind starts sprinting again. Plan this, change that, prove yourself, get ahead. You can almost feel the tightening in the body, the shallow breath, the clenched jaw, the tension behind the eyes. That's not life's pressure, it's the ego tightening its grip. If you pay close attention, you'll start to recognize the telltale signal that the ego has taken back the wheel. Resistance, the sense that something needs to be different now. Presence has no urgency, it simply perceives. The ego, however, cannot rest in the present moment. It needs a problem to solve, a villain to fight, a future to chase. So when you feel that pulse of inner restlessness, that's the alarm bell. It's the ego saying, "Let me drive again." The fascinating thing is that the ego isn't an enemy. It's a structure of protection that's outlived its usefulness. It was designed to keep you safe, to give you a sense of continuity in a chaotic world. But once awareness begins to awaken, that same structure becomes a cage. The more consciousness expands, the tighter the ego's walls feel. The resistance you experience isn't proof that you're failing, it's proof that you're growing. The old shell is cracking. There's a point in this inner process where the ego's counterattack peaks. You might feel disoriented, as if you're being pulled between two realities, the stillness of the observer and the noise of identity. It can feel exhausting. But in those moments, remember this: what's fighting for control is not the real you. It's a pattern defending its existence, and a pattern only survives when you feed it attention. So instead of fighting back, try watching the resistance itself. Observe the drama, the guilt, the urgency, as if they were weather passing through your sky. The very act of observing the ego is the observer reclaiming its ground. No battle, no argument, just quiet awareness. The storm eventually tires of performing when no one reacts to it. And yet, the ego has one last trick. Just when you start to relax into awareness again, it whispers a seductive thought. Look at how conscious you are now. In that instant, identification returns in a new disguise. The observer becomes proud of observing. It's a delicate trap because it feels spiritual, but it's still the same mechanism of me. Recognizing this paradox is the next frontier. Because true observation has no pride, no ownership, no one doing it. It's awareness without a doer. Before we move on, pause for a moment and test this directly. Take a breath and notice what's happening inside you right now. Can you sense where resistance lives in your body, maybe as tension, restlessness, or pressure to get it right? Don't try to fix it, just look. That's the observer reasserting itself. And if this part resonated with you, if you can feel that inner tug-of-war between awareness and the old patterns, take a second to anchor it. Like this video so you remember this turning point and write in the comments, "I see my resistance." Those 3 words are not for me. They're a declaration to yourself that the observer is still here, still watching. Because the moment you can see resistance clearly, you're ready to uncover the next layer. The hidden mistake people make when they try to stay aware for too long. After the first awakening of awareness, many people fall into a subtle but seductive mistake, the attempt to stay as the observer at all times. They hear that observing brings freedom, so they turn it into a goal, a discipline, even an identity. The mind quietly takes over the practice of awareness and transforms it into another project for self-improvement. Without noticing, the ego reappears, now wearing the robe of detachment. This is the fatal error, mistaking observation for separation. It begins innocently. You start noticing your thoughts and emotions, and it feels liberating. But soon, a small ambition creeps in, the desire to stay untouched, calm, and permanently above the chaos of life. You begin to use observation as a shield, a way to avoid the messiness of human experience. You start saying things like, "I'm not angry, I'm just watching anger arise." But if you look closely, you'll see that's not genuine awareness. It's avoidance disguised as wisdom. True observation doesn't distance you from life, it brings you fully into it. It's not standing on a mountaintop, analyzing the storm below. It's being in the middle of the rain without losing your center. When you try to be too aware, you turn life into an object of study rather than a living relationship. You begin to analyze your feelings instead of feeling them. You start monitoring your reactions instead of being present with them. The mind creates an internal commentator that's constantly checking whether you're observing correctly. And ironically, that commentator is the very ego you were trying to transcend. There's a fine line between awareness and control, and the ego knows exactly how to blur it. It says stay mindful, stay detached, stay in the observer state. It sounds noble, but the intention behind it is fear. Fear of being overwhelmed, fear of making mistakes, fear of losing the spiritual progress you think you've made. So you begin to contract, to hold life at a safe distance. You stop laughing too loudly, loving too fully, crying too deeply. You start to look calm, but inside, you're quietly tense, constantly measuring how present you are. This kind of sterile observation creates a split, the observer on one side and life on the other. But real consciousness is not divided. When the observer is genuine, there's no someone watching. There's just awareness, lying seamless, alive, participating in every sensation without clinging to any of them. You feel sadness without being swallowed by it, joy without trying to keep it. Observation at its purest is intimacy, not detachment. Think of a musician so immersed in playing that they're completely aware, yet not self-conscious. The music flows through them. They don't have to think, I am now observing my fingers on the instrument. The awareness is inherent in the act. That's the kind of observation that transforms, effortless, embodied, fully engaged with the moment. The moment you start thinking, I must stay aware, the flow is already interrupted. Awareness turns into an object instead of a living field. When you push observation too far, something else happens. Your heart begins to close. You become efficient at noticing thoughts, but clumsy at feeling life. You might even start to lose empathy, because emotions, both yours and others, feel like disturbances in your serenity. But awareness without openness is sterile. The observer's true strength is not detachment but compassion, the ability to witness pain without collapsing, to witness joy without grasping. It's also worth noticing that the body reflects this imbalance. The over-observer often feels slightly rigid, shoulders tight, breath shallow, eyes alert but not soft. The body mimics vigilance because it's living in a state of subtle control. You can sense the difference when awareness is natural. The breath deepens, the muscles loosen. Attention feels fluid rather than sharp. Observation is meant to be like breathing, rhythmic, alive, not a frozen stare at your own mind. If you find yourself overanalyzing, trying to do awareness perfectly, that's the signal to let go a little. Let yourself be human again. Eat your meal without naming each sensation. Talk to someone without checking how present you feel. Laugh at your own seriousness. The observer doesn't need you to maintain it. It's already there, quietly watching whether you remember it or not. The more you relax, the more naturally it returns. The paradox is that the observer's power increases when you stop trying to sustain it. Consciousness thrives in softness, not control. The true observer doesn't retreat from life. It breathes through it, as it, effortlessly. Observation was never meant to replace living. It was meant to illuminate it. But many people never reach that balance because they're caught in the tension between awareness and engagement. They try to choose one over the other, not realizing they were never separate to begin with. Yet the real transformation happens exactly where those two meet, where observing and acting become one coherent movement. And that hidden alignment is where the next discovery begins to unfold. There's a quiet moment in every genuine act of awareness when something extraordinary happens. Observation and action begin to merge. The split between the one who sees and the one who does starts to dissolve, and what remains is a kind of effortless coherence, a natural intelligence expressing itself through movement. It's not that you stop acting, it's that your actions no longer emerge from reaction, defense, or habit. They arise from clarity. When the observer and the actor are out of sync, life feels like constant friction. You say things you didn't mean, make decisions you later question, or feel torn between what you know is right and what you end up doing. That dissonance isn't moral weakness. It's a symptom of fragmentation. The observer sees one thing, the conditioned self does another. There's delay, distortion, confusion. But when the two align, the energy that was once spent in conflict becomes available as presence. This alignment doesn't happen through control. It happens through surrender. The moment you stop trying to manage yourself, to be perfect, to appear wise, to perform consciousness, something deeper takes over. The observer, once silent in the background, begins to guide movement directly. You respond to life instead of reacting to it. The words that come out of your mouth feel clean, unforced. Decisions arise not from the pressure of time, but from a kind of inner timing that feels perfectly synchronized with what's happening. Imagine a craftsman in a workshop, his hands shaping wood. He isn't calculating every movement, yet nothing is random. Awareness and action are one continuous flow, perception guiding precision. He doesn't say, Now I will observe myself sanding this surface. He simply sees, feels, adjusts, and moves. That's what alignment looks like when lived. The observer isn't a spectator, it's the intelligence operating through the act. This is why true observation never leads to passivity. Some people fear that being aware will make them detached, like standing back while life unfolds without participation. But when the observer truly leads, the opposite happens. You become more responsive, more alive. There's a quiet authority in your gestures, a sense of timing that doesn't come from thought, but from attunement. You begin to act from understanding rather than impulse. The difference is tangible. Reaction feels tight, fast, and narrow, like being pushed by invisible hands. Aligned action feels open, grounded, precise. It doesn't mean you always know what to do. It means that whatever you do emerges from presence, not panic. Even mistakes become part of the flow, observed, adjusted, learned from, without shame. Awareness transforms error into information. This inner coherence also has a visible signature in the body. When observation and action separate, the body feels divided. Shoulders tense, breath shallow, gestures either rigid or erratic. But when they align, the body relaxes into efficiency. Movements are economical, the voice steadier, the eyes more direct. It's as if energy stops leaking through internal resistance. You can feel that the doer has stepped aside and something larger, quieter, but more precise is moving through you. In neuroscience, this alignment can be seen as a state of high integration between observation and execution networks in the brain, a synchronization of awareness and motor activity. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for conscious attention, communicates seamlessly with the motor cortex which governs movement. You are literally rewiring your nervous system to act with consciousness. But in lived experience, it doesn't feel technical at all. It feels like grace, not the religious kind, but the natural elegance of unforced being. You might start noticing it in small, unexpected moments. You speak with someone who's upset, and instead of preparing your next sentence, you find yourself listening so deeply that words emerge on their own, gentle, clear, exact. Or you walk into a difficult situation at work, and rather than strategizing, you simply perceive what's needed. The response comes not from logic alone, but from awareness acting through logic. The observer has taken the lead, and this shift, though subtle, changes the entire rhythm of life. You stop spending energy repairing the damage caused by unconscious reactions. You stop chasing outcomes to validate your sense of self. Your actions begin to carry the same quiet intelligence as your awareness. You realize that the observer doesn't watch life from the outside. It moves through life from within. Still, there's a question that lingers beneath this harmony. What is actually happening inside the brain and body when awareness leads? How does simple observation produce such a measurable shift in clarity and emotional regulation? Science has begun to uncover the biological patterns behind this alignment, the neural imprint of conscious observation itself. And what those discoveries reveal is that this isn't just philosophy. The observer literally changes the machinery of your mind. When you begin to observe consciously, something profound yet measurable happens inside the brain. What feels like a quiet inner shift is, in fact, a complex biological reorganization, a rebalancing between ancient survival mechanisms and higher centers of awareness. Conscious observation doesn't just feel different, it functions differently. The very act of noticing changes the machinery that notices. In the most practical terms, every moment of observation begins as a signal. When you observe a thought or emotion without reacting, neural pathways that were once bound to reactivity begin to weaken. The amygdala, the small almond-shaped region in the brain responsible for fear, fight, and flight, starts to quiet. It no longer fires at every perceived threat or discomfort. Instead, blood flow increases toward the prefrontal cortex, the area that governs reflection, regulation, and deliberate decision-making. This shift marks the transition from survival mode to awareness mode. Over time, this reorganization becomes physical. Brain imaging studies show that mindfulness and conscious attention literally reshape neural density. The prefrontal cortex thickens, the amygdala shrinks, and the communication between these regions becomes more efficient. You're not just having calmer thoughts. Your brain is learning calm as a skill. It's as if conscious observation rewrites the operating system of your nervous system, line by line. But the science only explains half of it. The subjective experience, the felt sense of this change, is where the real transformation is lived. You begin to notice that emotions still arise, but their grip weakens. Anger no longer hijacks your whole body. Anxiety still visits, but doesn't linger. There's a small but vital pause between stimulus and response, a neurological echo of awareness expanding. That pause is the physical manifestation of the observer. Think of it this way: every reactive impulse travels through an old highway in the brain, fast, familiar, instinctive. But when you observe consciously, you begin to build a new route, one that passes through awareness first. At first, it feels slower because the pathway is unpaved. But with repetition, the new route strengthens, becoming the preferred mode of travel. Neuroscientists call this neuroplasticity. In spiritual terms, it's the rewiring of consciousness itself. There's also a profound effect on the body's chemistry. When awareness replaces reactivity, cortisol, the stress hormone, begins to drop. Heart rate variability, a marker of resilience, improves. The body learns to trust presence. The nervous system becomes less like an alarm and more like an instrument, tuned to subtlety rather than threat. You begin to feel the difference: clarity instead of tension, openness instead of contraction. But what's most fascinating is how the brain's default mode network, the cluster of regions responsible for self-referential thought, the endless narration of me, also begins to quiet down. Under the influence of conscious observation, that network loses dominance. You still have a sense of self, but it's no longer at the center of every perception. Awareness becomes more spacious. You start to experience thoughts and sensations as events happening within consciousness, not as extensions of your identity. This neurological shift mirrors an ancient insight that the self is not the doer, but the field through which doing happens. The brain's systems align with that truth as you practice observation. What was once a dense network of self-protective loops becomes a flexible architecture capable of coherence. Coherence, that elegant synchrony between brain, body, and awareness, is not a mystical state. It's what happens when the mind stops fighting itself. To observe consciously is to bring order to chaos without suppression. The nervous system is designed to mirror attention. Where awareness goes, energy reorganizes. If your attention feeds panic, the brain strengthens panic. If your attention rests in observation, the brain strengthens presence. Over time, observation becomes the new baseline, a neurological signature of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. In this way, conscious observation is both scientific and sacred. It bridges the measurable and the immeasurable. The neurons reorganize, but so does the sense of being. You start to realize that awareness isn't a fragile state to maintain. It's the default state of the system once interference ceases. The observer isn't a spiritual ideal, it's an evolutionary function of consciousness learning to see itself. And here lies the deeper twist. You don't make the observer appear. The neural shifts, the calm, the clarity, they unfold when you stop trying to control the process. Observation isn't something the self performs, it's what remains when the self relaxes. In other words, the observer isn't a result of the brain's effort. It's the condition that allows the brain to function coherently in the first place. That realization that you cannot create the observer because it has always been there marks the next threshold of transformation. What comes next is not about developing awareness, but about surrendering the illusion of control. It's the moment when the observer stops being a practice and is revealed as the very essence of what you are. For a while, it feels like you're learning how to observe. You make a conscious effort to watch your thoughts, to stay present, to respond instead of react. It feels like progress, a spiritual discipline, a form of mental training. But then, something strange happens. The more you try to do observation, the heavier it becomes. The effort that once seemed noble begins to feel artificial. You start wondering, who exactly is trying to observe here? That's where the hidden twist reveals itself. You don't control the observer. You never did. The observer isn't something you summon or sustain. It's what's already here when the noise quiets. It doesn't depend on your focus, your will, or your practice. It's not the result of effort, but the backdrop of all effort. You don't observe as someone. Observation simply happens through you. At first, this realization can feel disorienting. The mind doesn't like losing its job. It's spent a lifetime managing, strategizing, monitoring. So when awareness starts to unfold by itself, the mind rushes in to claim ownership. It says, look, I'm observing very well today, but that statement exposes the lie. The I that claims to observe is still part of what's being observed, another ripple on the surface of consciousness, pretending to be the ocean. If you look closely, you'll see that the observer doesn't belong to time. It doesn't begin when you decide to be mindful, and it doesn't disappear when you forget. It's present during your highest moments of clarity and your darkest lapses into confusion. It's there when you meditate, and when you shout, when you breathe deeply, and when you forget to. The observer is not an act of attention, it's the field within which attention happens. You can sense this most clearly in moments of stillness. Imagine sitting alone at night, lights low, no task demanding your attention. A thought passes by, then another, then silence. Yet even when the mind goes quiet, awareness doesn't vanish. Something remains, alive, alert, untouched. That something is not personal. It doesn't carry your name or your story. It's not male or female, not young or old. It's just presence, the unbroken continuity beneath every experience. When you see this, even for a heartbeat, an extraordinary peace begins to unfold. You realize that consciousness has never been yours. It's what you belong to. You were never the one observing. You were the observation itself. The sense of I am watching transforms into the simple knowing of there is watching. The subject-object split dissolves, and what remains is awareness, aware of itself. It's a humbling revelation because it dismantles the last refuge of the ego, the spiritual identity that thought it could master awareness. The ego can adapt to almost anything. It can wear humility, discipline, even compassion as masks. But it cannot coexist with the truth that awareness is not owned. Once that realization lands, the illusion of control begins to crumble. What takes its place is not passivity, but a kind of effortless flow, action without an actor. This is what many mystics meant by surrender. Though it has nothing to do with giving up or withdrawing from life, it's the end of resistance. Life acts through you as naturally as breath moves through lungs. You're no longer performing awareness, you're living as awareness. The boundaries between inner and outer blur. Decisions arise not as choices, but as responses from the whole. And yet, this awakening can feel strange at first. The mind, trained to seek reference points, tries to name the experience. Is this enlightenment? Is this detachment? But every attempt to define it pulls you back into identification. The truth of the observer cannot be grasped because it's not an object. It's the space in which grasping occurs. The moment you think you have it, you're already one step removed from it. To live this realization is to enter a quieter rhythm. You stop chasing awareness and start trusting it. You stop trying to stay in the observer and begin to notice that you've never actually left it. The observer isn't a place you visit. It's what you've always been, even when you were lost in the story of me. But as this truth deepens, another shift begins to occur, not within consciousness itself, but in how life unfolds through it. When the observer fully takes the lead, when life is lived from that space of non-doing, something irreversible happens. The old identity loses all authority. The person you thought you were no longer runs the show, and yet life doesn't collapse, it expands. That's the point of no return, the moment when observation and existence become one seamless movement and living itself turns into a conscious act of being. There comes a point in this journey where something quiet but irreversible happens. It's not dramatic, and no one around you would notice. You wake up one day, look around, and realize the center from which you used to live is gone. The character, the one who chased, feared, defended, and compared, has lost its throne. The story continues, but the storyteller has stepped out of the narrative. You are no longer the person who tries to be aware. You are the awareness through which the person moves. That's the point of no return. This shift doesn't make life easier in the conventional sense. It doesn't erase challenges, losses, or emotions. They still appear, but their meaning changes. When something painful happens, the observer doesn't interpret it as punishment or misfortune. It simply sees, this is what's arising now. There's no need to assign blame, no urge to escape, no internal resistance to what is. Paradoxically, this doesn't make you indifferent. It makes you deeply intimate with life. When you no longer cling to experience, you can finally feel it fully. To live as the observer is to exist without armor. There's no constant defending of opinions, no need to prove worth, no frantic search for validation. You still speak, act, and choose, but you do so from clarity, not compulsion. The ego once lived like a constant commentary track, narrating everything that happened. Now that commentary fades into the background. Silence, not the absence of sound, but the absence of interference, becomes the natural state. From the outside, nothing special seems to have changed. You still work, eat, interact, laugh, but from within the texture of experience is completely different. Life feels transparent, lighter, as if each moment passes through you rather than sticking to you. A thought comes, you notice it, and it goes. A strong emotion rises, you feel it fully, and it dissolves. There's no residue, existence flows without friction. Sometimes this can feel like living in two dimensions at once, the surface where events unfold, and the depth, where stillness watches it all. You can be in the middle of an argument, a busy day, or a deep grief, and yet something in you remains untouched, aware and vast. You no longer confuse movement with chaos. The ocean of awareness holds every wave. There's a biological echo of this transformation. The nervous system begins to recalibrate around stillness rather than tension. The baseline shifts from alertness to openness. Even under stress, your body recovers faster because it's no longer operating under the illusion of constant threat. The mind becomes less of a battlefield and more of a field of perception. What was once fragmentation becomes coherence. Living as the observer literally changes how your physiology organizes experience. At this stage, identity becomes fluid. You can play roles, parent, leader, friend, artist, without becoming trapped by them. You step into each role fully, and then release it without residue. Life feels like a series of improvisations guided by intelligence rather than effort. Decisions come not from overthinking, but from direct knowing. The observer doesn't need to plan, it moves in harmony with what unfolds. There's also an unexpected warmth in this state, a natural compassion that doesn't need to be cultivated, because you see that everyone, including yourself, is caught in their own play of identification. The observer recognizes itself behind every pair of eyes. Judgments lose their sharpness. Forgiveness happens not as a moral act, but as an obvious expression of understanding. How can awareness hate its own reflections? What disappears in this stage is not personality, but attachment. You still have preferences, humor, quirks, opinions, but none of them define you. You can express them freely because they're not who you are. Life becomes spontaneous, not strategic. Even mistakes are met with gentleness, because you see that the observer never errs. Only the character does, and that's part of its learning. And yet, this state isn't static. It's not the end of a journey, but the end of seeking. Once you've crossed the threshold into living as the observer, the idea of attaining anything dissolves. There's nowhere left to go, because you're already where life happens. The search for meaning transforms into the experience of being meaning itself. Still, the story of human life continues, with its beauty, its unpredictability, its cycles of birth and decay. Awareness doesn't remove you from it. It allows you to live it fully without drowning in it. You become both participant and witness, movement and stillness, sound and silence, one continuous field of perception expressing itself through form. And in that field, one truth becomes unshakable. Life was never something happening to you. It has always been happening as you, The observer and the observed are not two sides of existence. They are the same movement finally seen as one. When the observer takes the lead, the old identity no longer rules. Life doesn't need to be controlled or defended. It unfolds through you with a quiet intelligence of its own. You stop being the character struggling inside the story and return to being the awareness writing it. That single shift changes everything: how you think, how you act, how reality responds. Every moment becomes an invitation to live consciously, not by trying to be aware, but by remembering that awareness was never lost. The world you see outside begins to mirror the stillness inside. If you made it here, write in the comments, "I am the awareness behind it all." It lets me know you stayed until the end and fully present. And if this message resonated with you, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen right now. Each one goes deeper into this same space of consciousness, where observation becomes creation and life itself becomes your practice.